Jack had lived alone in his small, weather-worn cabin in the woods for nearly 10 years. The place was a bit rough around the edges, but it was his home. Since his wife had passed away, Jack had chosen a life of solitude. His cabin, far away from the nearest neighbor, was the perfect place to escape from the world. He worked with his hands, chopped wood for the fire, and spent long hours walking through the forest. It wasn't that Jack didn't miss people, but the pain of losing his wife had made it hard for him to be around others. He found comfort in the quiet. The sounds of birds, wind, and the rustling leaves were all the company he needed. It was late in the evening, the kind of still night when everything felt calm, but a little eerie too. A soft rain had started to fall outside, creating a rhythm as it tapped against the roof. Jack sat by the fireplace, staring at the flames flickering and dancing. He hadn't been this content in a while, the silence around him only broken by the occasional crackle of the fire. His cabin was warm and smelled like pine and firewood. Jack had just started to nod off when a sudden knock on the door broke through the silence. It was loud, sharp, and unexpected. Jack jumped, his heart pounding in his chest. Who could possibly be out there in this weather? His hand instinctively reached for the hunting knife beside him. He had always kept it nearby, just in case. But he never thought he'd have to use it on anyone, at least not on anyone who didn't deserve it. The knock came again, more desperate this time. Jack stood slowly, his legs stiff from sitting for so long. He walked cautiously to the door and peered through the small window beside it. The sight that met his eyes was something he never could have expected. A little girl, drenched from head to toe, stood on his doorstep. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old. Her clothes were ragged, her face pale, and her hair clung to her face in wet strands. She was shivering, her small body trembling from the cold, and yet her eyes looked terrified, like she had seen something that would haunt her forever. "Help, please," she said in a small, shaky voice as Jack opened the door. Her words were barely audible, lost beneath the sound of the rain falling heavily all around them. Jack instinctively stepped back, allowing the girl to step inside. He quickly grabbed a towel from a nearby shelf and wrapped it around her shoulders. Her skin felt cold, almost like ice. She winced at the touch but didn't pull away. She looked at him with wide, frightened eyes, the fear in them deeper than anything Jack had ever seen in a child's gaze. "Are you okay?" Jack asked gently, his voice calm despite the sudden rush of confusion in his mind. He didn't know what to think. Was she lost? Had she wandered away from her family? The woods were deep and wild, and a child alone out here at night was something he could never imagine. The girl didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared at him for a moment as if she was trying to figure out whether she could trust him or not. Then finally her lips parted and she whispered something that made Jack's heart race. "They hurt Mommy. Now they want me too." Jack froze. His hand, still holding the towel, trembled slightly as he processed her words. He didn't know what she meant, but something about the way she said it made his blood run cold. There was no denying the fear in her voice. Something bad had happened. He could see it in her eyes, and he could hear it in the way she spoke. "They hurt Mommy," the girl repeated, her voice now louder, almost frantic. She clutched her teddy bear tighter against her chest, as if it were the only thing left in the world she could hold on to. "Now they want me too. I don't know what to do." Jack knelt down to her level, trying to offer her some comfort, though he himself felt more confused than ever. He gently placed his hand on her shoulder, trying to soothe her, but his mind was racing with questions. Who was she talking about? Who were they? And why would anyone hurt a child's mother and now go after her too? "Take a deep breath," Jack said softly, trying to calm her. He was unsure of what to do next, but the girl needed help. That much was clear. "Tell me what happened. Where's your mommy now?" The girl shook her head, tears beginning to well up in her eyes. She didn't want to answer, but she knew she had to. She opened her mouth as if to say something more, but then stopped, her lips trembling. "I don't know where she is," the girl whispered, looking down at the ground. "They took her, and they said they'd come for me next." Jack felt a tight knot in his chest. He didn't know who these people were, or what they had done to this girl's mother, but he knew one thing for sure. This child was in danger. Whatever was going on, it wasn't just some lost child stumbling through the woods. There was something much darker at play here. Jack's mind raced as he thought about what to do. He couldn't just let her stay here. He didn't have the means to keep her safe in his cabin, especially if whoever had hurt her mother was still out there looking for her. But where could he take her? There was no one around for miles. The nearest town was a long drive away, and that would take too long. He needed to act quickly. "Listen, I'm going to take care of you," Jack said, more firmly now. "You're safe here for tonight. I'm not going to let anything happen to you, but I need you to tell me everything you can. The more I know, the better I can help you." The girl's eyes darted around the cabin as if she was unsure whether to trust him or not, but then she nodded slowly, her tiny shoulders still shaking with fear. "They came last night," she started, her voice cracking as the memory seemed to overwhelm her. "Mommy told me to hide in the closet when they came. She said she'd be okay, but they found her, and I heard her scream. I couldn't help her. I couldn't do anything. She told me to stay hidden, but I wanted to save her so badly." Jack's heart broke as he listened to the girl's story. He wanted to hold her and tell her it would all be okay, but he knew the truth was far darker. Whoever had done this to her mother, whoever was after this little girl now, was not someone Jack could easily fight off. There was something dangerous about this whole situation, something far worse than just a lost child in the woods. But he couldn't let her go. "Not like this, don't worry," Jack said softly, his voice reassuring despite the fear swirling inside him. "You're safe now, and we'll figure this out, but we have to stay careful. Do you understand?" The girl nodded silently, clutching her teddy bear even tighter as Jack stood up. He moved to the window and peered out through the blinds, looking into the dark woods surrounding his cabin. There was no sign of anyone, no movement, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As he turned back to the girl, he knew one thing for sure. The night had only just begun, and the real danger was still out there. The following morning was cold, with a heavy mist hanging over the woods. The air smelled fresh, but there was an eerie stillness. Jack sat at the small kitchen table, rubbing his eyes as he stared at the little girl who had barely slept through the night. Her name, she had told him, was Emily. She was small, fragile, with wide eyes that seemed to carry more fear than any child should have to bear. She hadn't said much after her first outburst, but Jack could see the turmoil in her and the fear she felt. She was alone in a way that no one should ever be. Jack knew he needed to do something. He couldn't just keep her locked away in his cabin, especially if the people who had hurt her mother were still out there looking for her. But taking her into town would be risky. He didn't know if the men who had threatened Emily's mother would recognize her, and Jack didn't know if they had other plans for the girl. He needed to get answers, and to get answers he needed to know more about who these men were and what they were after. He decided that they would go into town. It would be a long drive, but the sooner he got the sheriff involved, the better. He just had to hope that Emily wouldn't be too frightened to speak, and that she could tell him exactly what had happened. But Jack could see the worry in her eyes as they got ready to leave. "Are you sure it's safe to go to town?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. She had clutched her teddy bear all night, and it was now tightly held in her arms as if it were the only thing that could give her comfort. Jack gave her a reassuring smile. "I think it's the best thing we can do. If those men are still around, we'll need help. The sheriff will know what to do." Emily didn't say anything, but Jack could see she wasn't convinced. It wasn't surprising. How could she trust anyone after everything she had been through? Jack's heart ached for her, but he had to keep his focus. They couldn't stay here forever. If they didn't do something soon, they would never be safe. They set out in Jack's old truck, the wheels crunching over the wet gravel as they left the cabin behind. The drive to town was slow, the fog making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Jack's eyes darted nervously to the rearview mirror every so often, just to be sure no one was following them. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, but there was nothing to see in the misty woods. As they approached the town, Jack noticed the streets were unusually quiet. It was early in the morning and most people were still indoors. Jack had always preferred the quiet of the woods, but now the silence in town felt unsettling. The town was small, with only a few shops and homes scattered around the main square. It wasn't the kind of place where big problems occurred. But this wasn't a normal situation. Emily's mother had been hurt, and now Emily was at risk. Jack parked the truck near the sheriff's office and helped Emily out. She clung to his side, her tiny hand gripping his sleeve as they walked into the building. Inside, the sheriff's office was dimly lit, the smell of stale coffee and dust hanging in the air. The sheriff, a tall, heavy-set man named Sheriff Harris, looked up from his desk as they entered. Well, the sheriff said, his voice gruff. "What can I do for you, Jack? Haven't seen you around here in ages." Jack hesitated for a moment, unsure how to explain the situation. But when he looked down at Emily, her face pale and worried, he knew he had no choice. He had to tell the sheriff everything, even if it didn't make sense. Jack was certain of one thing. The people who had hurt Emily's mother were not ordinary criminals. They were dangerous, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. "I need your help," Jack said quietly. "This little girl Emily showed up at my cabin last night. She says her mother was hurt by a group of men, and now they're after her." Sheriff Harris raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean, after her?" Emily, still clutching her teddy bear, stepped forward. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it was filled with fear. "They hurt Mommy, and they said they'd come for me next." Sheriff Harris leaned back in his chair, eyeing Emily carefully. "I don't know what to tell you, Jack. We haven't had any reports of missing persons or assaults around here. I'd like to help, but I need more information. Can you tell me exactly what happened, Emily?" Emily's hands shook as she stared at the sheriff. She didn't want to talk, but Jack gave her a gentle nudge, encouraging her to speak. Emily took a deep breath, her small voice breaking the silence as she began to explain. "They came to our house at night," she started, her voice trembling. "There were 3 of them. They knocked on the door, but Mommy told me to stay in the closet. I heard her talking to them. She said she didn't have any money and they got mad. Then I heard screaming." Emily paused, her eyes wide with fear as the memory seemed to flood back to her. Jack could see that it was hard for her to talk about, but she kept going. "Mommy said I had to hide and that she'd be okay. But I didn't listen. I came out and I saw them. 2 of them were pushing her down. One of them was standing at the door looking at me. I ran and hid again, but I could hear them taking Mommy away. I don't know what they did to her." Sheriff Harris listened quietly, not interrupting. When Emily finished speaking, he sat still for a long time, processing the information. Jack could see the sheriff's face had changed. The calm, easygoing demeanor he usually wore was gone, replaced by a serious, troubled expression. "That's a pretty heavy story, Emily," the sheriff finally said. "But it doesn't make sense. No one's reported anything like this around here, and I don't know of any gang or group like the one you're describing." Jack was about to argue when Emily suddenly spoke up again, her voice low but firm. "They're not from here," she said, looking up at the sheriff. "They came from far away. And they're not normal. They wanted something from Mommy. They wanted something from me, too. I don't know what it is, but they said they'd come back for me." Jack's heart skipped a beat. What could these people want with Emily? What had they done to her mother? The sheriff sighed deeply, rubbing his forehead. "I'm going to have to look into this, Jack. I'll get a few of the deputies to start checking around, see if anyone knows about these men. But if they're not from here, it's going to be hard to track them down." Jack felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. He had hoped for answers, but the sheriff didn't seem to have any. Emily's story didn't fit with anything they knew about in the town. The situation felt more dangerous by the minute, and Jack wasn't sure where to turn next. "Is there somewhere safe we can stay?" Jack asked, his voice desperate. "I don't think it's safe for Emily to go back to the cabin. And I don't know who else to trust." The sheriff nodded, his expression hardening. "I'll make sure you're taken care of. We'll find somewhere safe for now." But as Jack looked at Emily, he realized that safety might not be something they could find so easily. The men who had hurt her mother were still out there, and they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. The sun was beginning to set as Jack and Emily left the sheriff's office, but the weight of the day seemed to pull the light from the sky faster than usual. It was as if the world around them was quietly reflecting the unease Jack felt deep in his chest. He had hoped that the sheriff would have answers, or at least some direction on what to do next. But instead, all he had were more questions, and a feeling that something far darker was lurking just beyond their reach. As they walked back to Jack's truck, Emily clung to his side more tightly than ever. Her small hand, still gripping her teddy bear, felt colder than it had earlier in the day. The fear she was carrying seemed to be growing, and Jack wished he could take it all away. But he knew deep down that there was no simple way to make this better. Whatever they were up against, it wasn't going to be easy to defeat. Jack glanced down at Emily, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes were full of the same terror she had carried with her since the night before, and he couldn't blame her. The child had witnessed things no one should ever have to see, and now she was on the run from people who clearly meant her harm. Jack knew it would take more than a sheriff's office and a few reassuring words to keep her safe. There had to be more to the story than what they had been told so far. They reached the truck and Jack helped Emily inside, trying his best to mask his own growing frustration. He had to figure out what was going on, who these men were and why they had hurt Emily's mother and were now after her. He couldn't leave her alone in this world, and he couldn't stand the thought of letting her down. She was the only thing that mattered now. As they drove back toward the cabin, Jack's mind was racing. He thought about all the places they could go, all the people they could turn to for help. But the further they went from the sheriff's office, the more Jack realized that the situation was beyond the sheriff's reach. This wasn't just a simple case of missing persons or some random act of violence. There was something more going on, something that didn't fit in with the quiet life of this small town. It wasn't until they reached the edge of town that Jack decided to do something he hadn't planned on. He couldn't just wait around for someone else to solve the problem. He had to take matters into his own hands. "I think we need to find out more about these men," Jack said, glancing at Emily as they slowed the truck. "I don't think anyone knows who they are, but there's someone who might." Emily didn't look up from her teddy bear, her fingers nervously running over its worn fur. "Who?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "There's an old man who lives near the outskirts of town," Jack replied, his tone thoughtful. "He's lived here longer than anyone else, and he knows the woods and people around here better than anyone. If anyone knows what's going on, it'll be him." Emily nodded, although she still seemed unsure. She wasn't used to trusting strangers, especially after everything she had been through. Jack didn't blame her. He wasn't sure he would trust anyone either if he were in her shoes. The drive to the old man's house wasn't long, but the feeling of dread seemed to hang in the air, making every minute feel longer. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained overcast, casting a dim light over the landscape. As Jack pulled up to the small, weathered house, he saw the man sitting on his porch. His name was Frank, and though he wasn't a sheriff or a lawman, Frank had a reputation for knowing everything that went on in the town, and a lot more about the surrounding woods than anyone else. Jack parked the truck and helped Emily out. She hesitated, holding on to him tightly, but Jack gently encouraged her to walk with him toward Frank's porch. Frank had seen Jack many times, but he didn't recognize the little girl standing beside him. Well, if it ain't Jack," Frank said, squinting up at them from his rocking chair. His voice was gravelly and his eyes were sharp, even though his body had started to show signs of age. He had lived through enough hard times to know when something wasn't right. "Who's this you've got with you?" "This is Emily," Jack said, glancing down at the little girl who was still holding onto his sleeve. "She's in trouble, Frank, and I think you might be able to help us." Frank gave them a long, careful look, his weathered face unreadable. He motioned for them to come up onto the porch where the air was cooler and the smell of old wood filled the space. Emily followed Jack hesitantly, but she stayed close to him, her small body still trembling. Frank waited until they were seated before speaking again. "So what's going on, Jack? You know I'm not a man to ask questions, but you've got me curious. What kind of trouble are you mixed up in?" Jack took a deep breath. He had never been one to talk about things like this, especially to someone like Frank, who had seen so much in his lifetime. But he had no choice. Emily's life depended on it. "I think someone's after her," Jack said quietly, glancing at Emily, who was staring at the ground. Her mother was attacked, and now these men, whoever they are trying to find her. Frank's expression didn't change, but Jack saw the slight narrowing of his eyes. "That's a heavy claim, Jack. What makes you think these men are after her?" Emily's head shot up and she spoke without warning, her voice shaky but firm. "They said they'd come back for me. They hurt Mommy, and now they want me." Frank turned his gaze to Emily, studying her for a long moment. Jack could see the gears turning in the old man's head, and for a second, it seemed like Frank wasn't sure whether to believe them, but then he sighed, his eyes softening. "All right then," Frank said after a long pause. "I know some things about the people around here, but I've been quiet about it. Things like this, well, they don't happen here often. You said these men came from out of town?" Emily nodded, her eyes wide with fear. Frank stood up slowly, walking to the back of his house where an old wooden crate sat. He rummaged through it for a few moments before pulling out a worn notebook. He flipped through the pages, muttering under his breath. When he finally stopped, he turned back toward them and gave Jack a hard look. "You're right to be worried. There's been talk of a group moving through the area recently. People said they were looking for something, but no one knew exactly what. There were rumors about them dealing in all sorts of things. People don't speak much about it, But I've heard enough to know that what you're dealing with is more than just some thieves. Jack's heart skipped a beat. This was the first solid lead he had gotten, and it was darker than he had expected. Frank leaned in, lowering his voice. These people? They're bad news. They don't leave survivors. But I've got some ideas about where they might be hiding out. Jack felt a rush of hope, but also a knot of fear. They were closer to answers now. But were they ready for what they might find? This expanded version of Part 3 continues to build the mystery, while introducing new characters and providing more insights into the danger Emily and Jack face. It deepens the connection between the two characters and sets the stage for more action to come. Jack's heart was racing as Frank finished speaking. The old man's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. They're bad news, Frank had said, his voice low and serious. Jack had always trusted Frank's instincts. He'd lived in the town long enough to know when something wasn't right. And the fact that Frank was this concerned only deepened the feeling of dread Jack had been carrying ever since Emily showed up at his cabin. Frank's information was the first solid lead they had, but it also made things even more complicated. The idea that these men were involved in something dark and dangerous made Jack's stomach twist. He wasn't just dealing with a few bad people who had hurt Emily's mother. He was getting pulled into something bigger, something he didn't fully understand yet. We need to find them before they find her, Jack said, his voice steady but urgent. He glanced down at Emily, who had been unusually quiet since they arrived at Frank's house. The little girl had been listening to every word but hadn't said a thing since Frank started talking about the men. Her eyes full of fear were focused on the ground as if she were trying to block out everything she was hearing. Frank nodded slowly, his face hard with determination. You're right, he said, but it's not going to be easy. They're not the kind of people you just find by asking around. They'll be hiding out somewhere no one goes. Jack glanced at Emily again, his protective instincts kicking in. He couldn't let her go through any more of this. Couldn't allow her to be caught in the middle of whatever these men were involved in. Where do we start? Jack asked Frank, his voice tinged with desperation. Where would they be hiding? Frank paused for a moment, thinking. There's a place, he said finally, up in the hills. It's an old cabin, one that no one uses anymore. It's deep in the woods, hard to get to. But I know they've been using it for things like this. The locals have stayed away from that area for years. It's perfect for people who don't want to be found. Jack felt his heart sink. He had heard of that cabin before, but it had been so long since anyone had mentioned it. People said it was cursed, abandoned, and forgotten. But now, hearing Frank talk about it like it was still in use, Jack knew it was their only lead. We need to go there, Jack said firmly. Emily can't stay here anymore. It's not safe. Frank looked at the girl with a mix of pity and understanding. It's not going to be easy, he warned. You'll have to be careful. These men won't hesitate to do whatever it takes to get what they want. And if they think you're a threat to them, they won't stop until they've taken care of you. Jack swallowed hard, trying to push back the rising fear in his chest. He couldn't afford to think about the danger, not now. Not when Emily was depending on him.
He nodded and turned toward Emily, who was still holding her teddy bear tightly.
Her face was pale, and her eyes darted nervously between Jack and Frank. She looked like she wanted to say something, but the words didn't come. Jack bent down and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. Emily, he said softly, trying to give her a reassuring smile. We're going to be okay. We're just going to find this cabin, figure out what's going on, and get you safe. Can you do that for me? Emily looked up at him, her wide eyes searching his face. After a long moment, she nodded slowly. Okay, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jack could see the trust in her eyes, and that made him even more determined to protect her. Let's go then, Jack said to Frank, his tone firm. He turned to leave, motioning for Emily to follow. Frank nodded and grabbed his jacket, stepping down from the porch. The drive to the cabin took longer than Jack expected. The road that led into the hills was narrow and winding, barely wide enough for the truck to fit. The further they went, the darker and thicker the trees became. It was as if they were heading into another world, one where nothing good ever happened. As they drove, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every rustling in the trees, every crack of a twig beneath the tires made his senses jump. His eyes darted around, scanning the woods for any sign of movement, but he saw nothing. Still, the feeling didn't go away. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Emily sat quietly in the passenger seat, clutching her teddy bear even tighter now, her face drawn with anxiety. Jack could tell she was scared, but she didn't speak. She hadn't spoken much since Frank's house, and Jack didn't know if that was because she was exhausted, or if the weight of everything she had been through was just too much for her to handle. After what felt like hours, they reached the base of a small hill. The trees here were dense, blocking out most of the daylight. The cabin Frank had mentioned was somewhere beyond the thick brush ahead, and Jack could feel his heart pounding as they made their way through the forest. Frank led the way, moving with ease through the trees as if he had walked this path 100 times before. Jack and Emily followed closely behind, trying to keep up, though Emily's small legs struggled with the uneven ground. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they reached the cabin. It was old, nearly falling apart. The walls were weathered, the windows broken, and the roof sagged in places. Jack felt a shiver run down his spine as he looked at it. It looked like a place no one should ever visit. It had the kind of atmosphere that made you want to turn around and run the other way, but Jack knew they had no choice. This was it. This was where they would find the answers. Frank stepped up to the door and knocked once hard. There was no answer. The silence that followed was suffocating, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. He motioned for Emily to stay close, and she obediently stepped behind him, her small hand clutching his sleeve. "We'll go inside," Frank whispered. "Stay close and don't make a sound unless I say so." Jack nodded, his grip on Emily's hand tightening as they followed Frank through the door. The air inside the cabin was musty and stale, the floor creaking beneath their feet. Dust hung in the air, and Jack had to force himself to focus, to ignore the uncomfortable feeling that crept up his spine. Frank led them into a small room in the back of the cabin. It was dimly lit, but there were signs of recent activity. Old bottles of water, a few blankets tossed on the floor, and what looked like a map spread across a table. Jack's heart skipped a beat when he saw it. The map was marked with various locations, some of them circled in red. It didn't take long for Jack to realize that the places marked weren't just random spots in the woods. They were locations where people had been seen, places where things had gone missing. The markings seemed to suggest a pattern. Frank walked over to the table and picked up the map, studying it for a moment before turning to Jack. "They've been here, and they're still here," Frank said, his voice low. "These men are using this place to track people. They're not just hiding, they're planning something." Jack's heart raced as he realized the full scope of what they were up against. These men weren't just looking for Emily. They were preparing for something bigger. And whatever it was happening right here in these woods. We need to stop them, Jack said, determination in his voice. "Whatever they're planning, we can't let it happen. We'll do whatever it takes to protect Emily." Frank nodded, his face grim. "It's not going to be easy, Jack, but you're right. We can't let them get away with this." The truth was out. The men they were hunting were part of something bigger, something far more dangerous than Jack had ever imagined. And now, with the map in front of them, they knew what they had to do. They were on the edge of something much darker than they could have prepared for. Jack's heart hammered in his chest as he stood in the small, dimly lit room, staring at the map that Frank had spread across the table. The more he looked at it, the more he realized how dangerous this situation had become. These men weren't just hiding out here, they were planning something. Something big. And they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. Jack looked over at Emily, who was standing beside him. Her eyes were wide with fear, but there was something else in them too. Something like determination. She hadn't said much since they arrived at the cabin, but he could see it in her face. She wasn't going to run. She wasn't going to let these men hurt her again. And Jack wasn't going to let them take her. Not while he was still standing. Frank was moving around the cabin, gathering what supplies they might need. He had lived in the woods long enough to know how to survive out here. Jack, however, felt out of place. His mind was racing, trying to figure out their next move. He couldn't just sit here and wait for these men to come to them. They had to be proactive, take the fight to them before it was too late. "You're sure about this?" Frank asked, his voice low as he turned to face Jack. "If we go after them, there's no turning back. These men play dirty, Jack, and they're prepared for a fight." Jack nodded. He knew what Frank meant. This wasn't going to be some easy confrontation. The men they were up against weren't ordinary criminals. They were dangerous, trained, organized, and willing to do whatever it took to get what they wanted. But Jack wasn't backing down, not now. Not after everything Emily had been through. He had already made up his mind. "We don't have any choice," Jack said, his voice firm. "We have to stop them, Frank. Whatever they're planning, it's too dangerous to let it happen. Frank studied him for a moment. His eyes narrowed. Then he sighed and nodded. All right then, but we'll need to move fast. They're not going to be sitting around waiting for us. The tension in the air seemed to grow thicker as Jack and Frank gathered what they needed. Emily stayed close to Jack, her small hand gripping his sleeve like a lifeline. She had been quiet for the most part, but Jack could tell she was scared. It was impossible not to be. But he also knew that she had something inside her, something stronger than fear. It was the same strength that had helped her survive the terrifying events that had brought her to his cabin. As they prepared to leave the cabin, Jack glanced at the map one last time. The marked locations were scattered across the woods, each one more ominous than the last. It was clear that these men had been operating here for a long time, using the secluded areas of the forest to hide and make their plans. They were using the wilderness as a shield, but now Jack and Emily were going to use it as their advantage. The drive back down the winding road was silent, except for the occasional creak of the truck's tires on the wet gravel. Jack's mind was focused entirely on what lay ahead. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. This wasn't just about protecting Emily anymore. It was about stopping something that could hurt more people than they knew. When they reached the edge of the forest, Frank slowed the truck and turned onto a narrow, overgrown path that Jack hadn't noticed before. The trees around them seemed to close in as they drove deeper into the woods, the light from the truck's headlights cutting through the thick darkness. We're close now, Frank muttered, his grip tight on the steering wheel. Keep your eyes open. Jack's muscles were tense, his senses heightened. He had a gut feeling that they were being watched, that at any moment someone might jump out of the shadows. But the forest around them remained still, silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It was the kind of quiet that made Jack uneasy. As the truck came to a stop, Jack felt a knot tighten in his stomach. They were here. The cabin where Frank said the men had been hiding out was just ahead. It was larger than he had imagined, standing dark and imposing in the clearing. The windows were black, the door slightly ajar, and the faint sound of voices drifted through the air. Frank pulled the truck to a stop and turned off the engine. The silence that followed felt suffocating. They had arrived, but now they had to face what lay inside. We go in quick and quiet, Frank whispered, his voice steady but tense. We don't want to alert them. They'll be on us before we can blink if we're not careful. Jack nodded, glancing at Emily. She was still holding on to her teddy bear, her knuckles white. Her eyes were locked on the cabin, her face pale and anxious. Jack knew she was terrified, but he also knew that she was braver than most people he had ever met. I'm not going to let them hurt you, Jack whispered to her, his voice full of reassurance. Emily nodded but didn't speak. She was still too afraid to say anything, but Jack could see the trust in her eyes. She believed him, and that belief was enough to give him the strength to move forward. They exited the truck, careful to keep their footsteps as quiet as possible on the soft earth. The cabin was only a few yards away now, and Jack's heart beat faster with every step. He could hear the voices clearer now, low and murmuring in the distance. Frank led the way, staying low and moving swiftly between the trees. Jack and Emily followed close behind, their steps barely making a sound. As they reached the edge of the clearing, Jack motioned for Frank to stop. He could see the men now, 3 of them standing by the cabin's door talking in hushed voices. They hadn't noticed them yet, but it wouldn't be long before they did. We have to move fast, Jack whispered, his voice tight with urgency. We can't let them get the upper hand. Frank nodded, then motioned for them to follow. Without warning, he sprinted toward the cabin, disappearing into the shadows. Jack and Emily followed closely behind, adrenaline pumping through Jack's veins as he prepared for the worst. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for, the confrontation that would decide everything. As they reached the cabin, Jack heard one of the men laugh, a low, cruel sound that made his blood run cold. He knew that if they didn't act now, it would be too late. Frank had already reached the cabin and was slipping inside, and Jack and Emily followed, their hearts pounding in their chests. Inside, the cabin was dark, only lit by a single lantern hanging on the wall. The men were still talking, their voices echoing off the wooden walls. Jack motioned for Emily to stay close, and she clung to him, her small hand gripping his sleeve with all the strength she had left. As Jack stepped forward, he saw the men turn, their eyes widening in shock. Frank had already taken one of them down, and now it was Jack's turn. Without hesitation, he lunged forward, knocking one of the men to the ground. Emily stood by the door, watching in silence, her face a mixture of fear and determination. The final moments of the confrontation happened quickly. The men fought back, but they were no match for Jack, Frank, and Emily's determination. With a few quick moves, they were subdued. The cabin fell silent once more, the threat finally over. Jack stood over the defeated men, his chest heaving with exhaustion. The danger had passed, but the weight of everything that had happened was starting to sink in. He had protected Emily, and together they had stopped the men from causing any more harm. As Emily slowly approached him, her face now relaxed, Jack felt a surge of relief. It was over. They had done it, and now Emily was finally safe. "We're going to be okay," Jack whispered, his voice filled with a quiet pride. Emily looked up at him and smiled, a small but genuine smile. "Yes," she whispered back. "We're safe now." And for the first time in a long while, Jack allowed himself to believe it.